In Washington keeps resurfacing a bottomless pit said to be a pathway to the paranormal.
Have you guys ever heard of Mel's Hole?
The blackened soil surrounding Mel's Hole has for decades been a source of whispers and unsettling speculation, a place where science and folklore collided in uneasy silence. Long before any team of researchers dared to send instruments into its depths, locals spoke of animals avoiding the site, of strange lights flickering at night, of a darkness that seemed heavier than absence of light. The hole was said to be bottomless, a passageway into something other than the Earth, a geological impossibility that consumed whatever was dropped into it without a trace. For years, these stories lived in the margins of rural conversation, dismissed by the scientific mainstream. That silence shattered when an international team of scientists finally lowered an autonomous underwater drone into Mel's Hole, seeking not only to map it, but to challenge the mythology that had turned the site into one of the most infamous enigmas of the natural world. Before we start, smash the like and subscribe buttons for more updates. The descent began with carefully calibrated instruments designed to measure depth, pressure, composition of the air, and thermal gradients. As the drone's sensors pierced deeper, what appeared on the monitors in the surface control tent unsettled the scientists almost immediately. Instead of barren rock walls, the hole revealed striations that shimmered faintly, as if coated with mineral deposits emitting their own subtle luminescence. This was no ordinary geological cavity. The drone's camera recorded surfaces that seemed to pulse, as though stone and something organic had fused into a seamless entity. The researchers exchanged quiet glances, each aware that they had already crossed into territory where textbook explanations faltered. Further down, the drone entered a section filled not with air, but with a viscous liquid darker than crude oil. Its consistency clung to the probe's sensors, interfering with data collection, yet also refracting the drone's lights in distorted patterns, bending them into spirals and prisms impossible in conventional physics. The command team debated pulling the drone back up, but the mission had been funded to press forward, and so the descent continued. As it did, the surrounding silence grew oppressive, interrupted only by static interference creeping into the communication feed. Every meter brought the sensation that they were lowering a fragile piece of technology into a place that did not want to be observed. When the drone's camera restabilized, it revealed a chamber vast enough to resemble a cathedral hollowed inside the earth. Columns of jagged crystalline structures stretched from floor to unseen ceiling, each humming faintly at frequencies the scientists' audio equipment struggled to categorize. The hum resonated in the bones of the crew above, even through layers of soil, rock, and technology. Within the chamber's depths, something moved. At first it was dismissed as interference, a trick of light, but then shapes became clear, silhouettes that shifted as though alive, gliding in the black fluid, dissolving and reforming like shadows cast by a fire unseen. The scientists struggled to contain their growing unease. None could describe the forms in biological terms. They were not fish, nor mammals, nor any species cataloged by taxonomy. Their outlines fluctuated, sometimes elongated, sometimes fractal, their motion deliberate yet free of recognizable anatomy. More alarming was their reaction to the drone. As its lights brightened, the entities swirled closer, congregating in coordinated spirals as though studying the machine, or perhaps the minds watching it through the live feed. The drone's instruments recorded sudden bursts of electromagnetic energy each time one of the entities neared, energy strong enough to disrupt navigation systems. It was not aggression in the traditional sense, but it was undeniably interaction. Beyond the alien presence in that chamber, the drone's sensors detected environmental readings that defied comprehension. Temperatures oscillated wildly in seconds, swinging from sub-zero cold to heat intense enough to melt steel. Radiation levels spiked in irregular pulses, yet none matched the isotopic signatures expected of known radioactive decay. Gravity itself seemed unstable, with the drone's accelerometers recording abrupt fluctuations, as if the pull of the Earth inside the hole shifted and realigned according to rules no physicist had written. The team grew silent, each grappling with the dawning realization that Mel's Hole was not merely a natural anomaly, but a breach into something alien to the planet itself. The drone pressed deeper still, and the imagery it relayed stripped away the last remnants of skepticism among the crew. Below the crystalline chamber opened another void, one so vast the drone's lights could not reach its edges. Suspended within this abyss was what appeared to be a structure, geometric in its design, with angular patterns repeating in perfect fractals. Its surfaces shimmered with symbols no human language had ever recorded, glowing faintly as though responding to the approach of the probe. The drone transmitted a brief sequence of readings before interference overwhelmed its systems. For a handful of seconds, however, the world saw what lay hidden beneath the soil, a monument or machine, perhaps older than the Earth itself, humming with energy beyond all known technology. It was at that moment the first wave of true terror struck the observers. The glowing forms from the upper chamber had followed the drone into this abyss. They swirled around the geometric structure, aligning themselves into patterns eerily similar to the shapes carved into its surface. The camera's feed began to distort, not with static but with images that were not its own. Faces, landscapes, flashes of skies filled with stars unlike any constellation known to astronomy appeared unbidden, as if the drone's sensors had been hijacked by something inside the hole. The crew recoiled, some tearing their headsets off, others frozen, unable to look away. It was no longer simple observation. Something inside Mel's hole was communicating, or worse, infiltrating. The terror grew not from overt hostility but from implication. The entities did not lash out. They simply hovered in alignment with the impossible structure, radiating signals that bent human instruments into visions of other worlds. If these beings were guardians, they guarded not a void but a device, a doorway, or a relic buried deeper than human civilization itself. And if the scientists had interpreted correctly, their exploration had triggered recognition, a call answered by something older and vastly more intelligent than humanity. Back at the surface, debates erupted. Some argued to sever the drone's tether immediately, to cut all connection and bury the site under reinforced concrete. Others demanded the mission continue, insisting the discovery represented the most profound moment in the history of science. The drone, now unresponsive to commands, continued its descent as though pulled by invisible currents. The feed flickered, shifting between distorted landscapes and glimpses of the drone itself reflected back from impossible angles. Then came the sound. The hum of the crystalline chamber deepened, spreading through the soil, rattling equipment, reverberating in the lungs of those present. It was not vibration alone, but resonance, a frequency that seemed to probe consciousness itself. Members of the crew reported fragments of thought not their own, images of black seas under alien skies, sensations of being observed from vast distances. For several minutes, the boundary between human perception and whatever lay beneath Mel's hole dissolved. The terror in the tent was palpable, not because of imminent destruction, but because of the unbearable certainty that something inside the hole had recognized them individually, memorizing their presence. When the feed finally went dark, no command had been given. The drone vanished from all telemetry, its signals cut as though swallowed not by malfunction, but by design. Instruments on the surface recorded one last surge of electromagnetic force rising from the depths, then silence, an absolute heavy silence that seemed to seal the encounter. The crew sat in stunned quiet, the implications pressing down on them like the weight of the Earth itself. What terrified the world was not simply the images or the data. It was the knowledge that a place once dismissed as myth concealed evidence of intelligence beyond comprehension, dwelling beneath ordinary soil. The realization spread quickly through the scientific community. This was no mere geological feature. It was a threshold, a carefully hidden locus of forces and entities humanity was not prepared to confront. If the crystalline chamber and the abyssal structure were natural, they rewrote geology and physics entirely. If they were artificial, then someone, or something, had been here long before recorded history, embedding their presence in the planet itself. Speculation multiplied. Were the entities explorers from another dimension, remnants of civilizations older than humanity, or guardians of a power source sealed away for reasons beyond comprehension? Each possibility was more unnerving than the last. Even more unsettling was the unspoken question: had the act of sending the drone disturbed a balance maintained for millennia? The silence after the final surge felt less like closure and more like waiting, as though the hole itself had acknowledged the intrusion and was now considering its next move. In the days that followed, the scientific team faced a torment no data set could quantify. They had uncovered knowledge that challenged the foundation of human understanding, yet every instinct warned against sharing it openly. The terror was not of monsters climbing from the depths, but of a truth too immense to integrate safely into human society. Beneath Mel's Hole lay a secret that shifted the scale of existence, a revelation that placed humanity not at the center of its world, but on the fragile edge of something incomprehensibly vast. And so, what began as an expedition to disprove local folklore ended as a moment where the world glimpsed the unimaginable. The underwater drone had gone where no human could survive, had returned images and readings that shattered boundaries between myth and science, and in doing so had opened a door that could never fully be closed again. The terror was not merely in what was seen, but in what was implied, that the Earth itself harbors mysteries so profound that discovery alone could destabilize the very sense of what it means to be human. The soil around Mel's Hole remained still after the drone vanished, but stillness did not equal peace. The scientists who had gathered for the mission found themselves caught in a storm of implications too vast to contain. The equipment sat silent, every monitor black, every sensor flatlined, yet none could leave. They remained, staring at the featureless hole in the ground, as if expecting it to speak again. What had begun as an expedition now felt like a vigil at the threshold of something that dwarfed the human mind. The atmosphere was heavy, not only with fear but with reverence, the dreadful reverence one feels standing before forces that could erase or reshape entire civilizations with a whisper of intention. In the hours that followed, the team debated their next steps, but every suggestion dissolved into paralysis. To send another drone seemed reckless, yet retreating felt equally impossible. The hole was no longer a legend to them. It was an active presence, alive in ways no science textbook could prepare them for. The decision was made not to decide, to hold the ground until higher authorities could be briefed. That delay, however, allowed for something even more disturbing to take place. Instruments that had recorded nothing since the drone's disappearance suddenly stirred, not in response to movement within the hole, but to phenomena in the surrounding environment. Magnetic compasses began to spin. Local wildlife, once absent from the area, appeared at the edges of the clearing, gathering in unnatural silence. Birds perched in concentric rings, mammals crouched low, all oriented toward the hole as though awaiting instruction. The scientists looked on in stunned recognition. Whatever existed within the depths had influence that reached far beyond the void itself. It soon became clear that the influence extended further still. Portable communication devices began picking up signals, bursts of sound compressed into static, but with underlying cadence, like fragments of a forgotten language trying to force itself into human perception. The signals carried no recognizable words, yet every listener reported the same sensation, that the meaning bypassed language altogether, implanting images and emotions directly into thought. Some saw flashes of immense oceans boiling under foreign skies. Others saw towering forms composed of light, standing watch over landscapes twisted beyond terrestrial familiarity. The most troubling accounts came from those who insisted they saw their own reflections but altered, as if observed from a timeline where humanity had evolved under entirely different rules. None of these visions could be validated with instruments, yet the unanimity of experience across multiple observers could not be ignored. The scientists wrote hurried notes, but their hands shook, the ink blotting into patterns that eerily resembled the fractal markings carved into the abyssal structure glimpsed before the drone went dark. Each mark felt less like coincidence and more like contagion, a design imprinting itself upon human consciousness simply through exposure. In that moment, they realized the hole was not simply a geological anomaly or even a concealed structure. It was an active system of influence, one that seeped into biology, cognition, and environment alike. The team's geologist, a seasoned professional hardened by decades in the field, was the first to speak the question aloud. What if Mel's Hole was not discovered but permitted? What if the soil had been hiding it, waiting until humanity was capable, or desperate, enough to notice? That suggestion sent chills through the tent. If true, then their drone mission had not been an act of intrusion, but an invitation answered. The possibility reframed the terror. The scientists were not merely witnesses. They were participants in a process older than humanity itself. Even as these realizations sank in, Seismic sensors recorded faint tremors emanating not outward, but upward. The vibrations were subtle, barely detectable, yet they carried a rhythm uncannily similar to the frequencies that had once hummed through the crystalline chamber. The Earth itself seemed to resonate in sympathy with what lay below. One by one, the scientists pressed their palms to the ground, not as an act of curiosity, but as an instinctive response. They could feel it, a pulse, faint but undeniable, moving through the soil like the heartbeat of something vast buried alive. Night fell over the site, but darkness brought no respite. The absence of the sun seemed only to amplify the presence of the hole. The stars above shimmered strangely, distorted as if the atmosphere itself were bending under unseen pressure. Long exposures taken with high-resolution cameras revealed constellations subtly rearranged, lines of light curving toward the position of the hole as though even starlight acknowledged its gravity. The astronomer on the team muttered incoherently, repeating calculations that no longer aligned with the heavens she had studied her entire life. The cosmos itself appeared complicit in the mystery, bending to a geometry alien to human mathematics. The terror deepened not through explosions or monsters, but through subtle, undeniable shifts in reality. Watches lost sync, recording different times despite starting together. Batteries drained instantly, then recharged without connection to power. Human senses themselves betrayed their hosts. One researcher described hearing voices beneath the ground even when the instruments were silent. Another smelled salt water, though no sea lay within hundreds of miles. A third collapsed after swearing she felt herself falling endlessly, even while standing upright. The hole was not content to remain a physical anomaly. It had begun seeding itself into perception, shaping the very way humans experience the world around it. By dawn, exhaustion had hollowed the team, yet none dared leave. The hole had become both a threat and a lure, commanding their presence with invisible gravity. When the first rays of sunlight struck the ground, the hole reacted. A low vibration rippled outward, resonating in every body, every instrument, every stone. The surface of the hole shimmered, not as water but as if space itself had thinned, revealing hints of landscapes hidden just beyond perception. Rolling mountains inverted in geometry, oceans hanging in midair, skies layered with colors unseen in the human spectrum, all blinked into existence for fractions of seconds, then vanished. It was not imagination. Cameras captured the distortions, though the images degraded into incomprehensible noise when studied afterward. The hole was showing glimpses of elsewhere, windows into realities inaccessible, yet undeniably real. For the scientists, this revelation carried implications more terrifying than any monstrous apparition. If Mel's hole connected to other dimensions, then the drone's disappearance was not destruction but translation. The machine might still exist, traversing landscapes no human eye was meant to see. If so, what else could cross? What if the entities glimpsed swimming in the abyss were not native to Earth at all, but travelers passing through from worlds humanity could neither conceive nor endure? The terror lay not in their existence, but in their mobility. Mel's hole was not a prison, it was a passageway, and passageways work both ways. In the following days, the psychological effects on the crew worsened. Dreams grew vivid, filled with symbols glowing in fractal loops, voices whispering in tones that blurred into the drone's lost recordings. Some awoke screaming, convinced they had been dragged downward in their sleep. Others awoke calm but speaking in tongues no one recognized, only to collapse when they regained consciousness. The most unnerving moments occurred when multiple team members reported the same dream simultaneously, describing the same landscapes, the same entities, even the same sensations of being watched. The boundary between collective reality and shared hallucination dissolved. The site itself began attracting phenomena impossible to ignore. Clouds gathered directly overhead, swirling without wind, forming patterns echoing the crystalline columns glimpsed in the drone footage. The animals that had gathered earlier multiplied, forming concentric circles closer and closer to the hole, their bodies unnaturally still, eyes unblinking. Geological instruments registered shifts in density within the Earth, as though vast hollow spaces were rearranging themselves beneath the crust. These were not earthquakes, but deliberate adjustments, the subterranean architecture of something ancient flexing and realigning. Then came the sound once more. Not a hum this time, but a resonance deep enough to rattle bones. It rose through the ground, carried by the air, vibrating tents and lungs alike. The scientists covered their ears, but the sound was inside them. a note that bypassed eardrums and reverberated through marrow. It was not random. It carried structure, a rhythm, a cadence. The linguist on the team insisted it was language, though not spoken by mouths or written by hands. It was language embedded in frequency, communication through resonance itself. If so, the whole was not merely influencing them. It was speaking directly to the foundation of their biology. What it said could never be translated in human terms, yet its meaning was unmistakable. Every researcher felt it simultaneously. Recognition. The whole had cataloged them, acknowledged them, folded them into its awareness. They were no longer observers but components of its process. The terror was existential, not physical. To be seen by something so vast was to feel reduced, fragile, insignificant. Humanity was no longer alone in its dominion over Earth. It was a footnote in a larger system of intelligence buried beneath their feet, one that had tolerated their presence until now. When the resonance ceased, silence returned, heavier than before. The scientists collapsed, trembling, their notes scattered, their instruments fried beyond repair. No new drone was lowered, no further experiments were attempted. The site became a void not only in the Earth but in human courage. The implications, however, lingered. If Mel's Hole was a passageway, then it was a passageway always open. If it was a monument, then it was a monument built for purposes beyond human comprehension. If it was a machine, then it was a machine still active, its processes unfolding beneath the soil, perhaps influencing events far beyond the boundaries of the site itself. The terror spread not through official reports, but through the unshakable knowledge carried home by each witness. Every glance at the sky, every vibration in the ground, every dream filled with symbols reminded them of what they had seen. The world they once understood as stable, knowable, and finite had been pierced. Beneath their feet lay proof of forces so immense and alien that all human constructs, nation, science, history, were rendered fragile illusions. And so the whole remained, silent yet seething, a wound in the earth through which terror itself had been revealed. What was found inside did not simply terrify the world because of its strangeness, but because it stripped away the comfort of ignorance. Humanity had stared into Mel's Hole and discovered not emptiness, but presence. An active, watching presence with the power to reshape reality at its whim. The true terror was not that the world had changed, but that it had always been this way, hidden in plain sight, waiting for the day humanity was reckless enough to look inside. They turned to what could still be trusted, the ground itself. Without lowering another device, the researchers laid out a lattice of reflective markers on the soil radiating from the rim and bounced pencil-thin beams across those points to watch for minute changes in distance. The web of light quivered in ways that weren't wind. Lines shortened and lengthened in cycles that refused to match thermal expansion, as if the very metric of space in that clearing loosened and tightened according to a silent clock. The effect was strongest nearest the rim, then decayed in a curve steeper than any inverse square and less forgiving than a simple exponential. The graphs were ugly with refusal, a tangle of deviations that mocked the confidence of theories they had once regarded as bedrock. They dug no trenches and drove no anchor bolts. Instead, they pressed shallow cores into the surface at intervals and withdrew slivers of soil to examine under handheld microscopes. Grains that should have been ordinary quartz displayed edges softened into curves, as though geometry itself had decided corners were in error. Some grains bore filigrees, minute ridges arranged in repeating sequences that didn't match any known crystal habit, a kind of pattern memory imprinted on inert silica. When one of the samples was set near the rim for comparison, the filigree sharpened, as if the pattern were a script that the whole encouraged matter to practice until each stroke became exact. They attempted a purely optical test with materials too simple to sabotage them, a sheet of white linen stretched across a frame, placed so the edge of the hole cast a crescent of shadow. In a sensible world, that crescent should have traced a predictable arc through the day. Instead, the curve wavered, fattened, and then thinned without reference to the sun's position. At moments, the crescent split into two, as if two suns had briefly existed to throw two overlapping shadows from a single edge. No cloud crossed the sky then. Nothing moved except the boundary between light and dark, behaving like a living thing unsure where it wanted to rest. A physicist sketched models on the back of a notebook. manifolds that changed signature, spaces that wore multiple metrics like layered clothing. She kept stopping to tear out the page and start again, not in frustration, but because the act of drawing seemed to commit the wrong topology to memory. Eventually, she settled on a language borrowed from information theory. Perhaps the hole wasn't a void among rocks, but a boundary in an error-correcting code far larger than the planet. A place where the code wrote itself into matter so meticulously that any deviation became music. The crystalline vault glimpsed by the drone, the angular structure below, the undulant entities that arranged themselves like symbols. All of it could be expressions inside a grammar matter usually hides. They moved quietly, as if a loud voice might cause the ground to forget its manners. A biologist seeded petri dishes with the dust gathered from those shallow cores and set them in a shaded box at different distances from the rim. She expected nothing: sterile dust, sterile dishes. By noon, translucent webs had formed in the dishes closest to the hole. Not mold, not bacterial colonies, something that arranged itself along the same filigree patterns etched into the quartz. No smell drifted up from the growth and no color announced metabolism. But when a pocket lens magnified the strands, tiny pulses moved along them in step with that silent clock the interferometers had betrayed. It wasn't life as she knew it. It was obedience to a cadence that life might choose to imitate when it found itself near such a metronome. An acoustic engineer suggested a test so gentle it felt like a superstition, rolling a pebble toward the rim and listening to the way it stopped. Pebbles don't stop on bare ground unless friction or obstacles insist. This one drifted, shivered, and came to rest a foot before the edge. Another pebble halted 3 inches sooner, as if a blind boundary lay there. Not a wall, but a preference. The surface answering with a quiet no to mass that wished to cross without invitation. When the engineer rolled a final pebble with a flick that should have carried it into the darkness, the stone skittered, curved, and described a perfect semicircle before returning to his boot. The air seemed to thicken with the implication that even a careless gesture had been measured and countered. They pointed a compact spectrometer across the opening and fired a weak beam into the yawning dark. If the beam scattered on dust or vapor, the instrument would show broadening. It did, but not the kind expected. The spectral lines didn't just spread, they split into ratios that corresponded to primes up to 19. Someone laughed without humor, the noise breaking off when they realized those same primes appeared in one of the physicist's pages, a doodle she had drawn hours ago and then crumpled. The hole did not echo their light. It decomposed it into mathematics and returned the result as if to say, "Here is your own structure held up like a mirror." A philosopher on the team, the only one with no instruments to adjust, said little until then. He had watched the tests with the soft focus of someone who refuses to let any single observation monopolize his attention. When the primes appeared, he spoke in a tone so calm it sounded like fatigue, but the words cut with clarity. Perhaps the terror was a failure of proportion. They had come with expectations suited to a world where cause and effect were neighbors, where observations sat at a polite distance. The whole offered a scale of relation closer to kinship. It didn't merely sit at the edge of their equations. It held those equations in the same way a living system holds a genome. Something to be transcribed, expressed, and sometimes corrected. They tried a test of time rather than space. A pair of synchronized mechanical watches, spring and gear, no electronics, were set on either side of a chalk line measured from the rim. After an hour, one had lost 21 seconds, the other had gained 14. Swapping their positions reversed the effect. The chalk line meant nothing. The gradient cared only for the invisible geometry it obeyed. Time, that most stubborn of rules, had consented to bend like a reed in a breeze. None of the team said the words aloud, but the recognition rose in every chest. If time softened here, then memory itself might be porous. They began to photograph their notes as they wrote them, not because paper could fail, but because recollection might. A radio left idling on a table had been nothing but hiss since the earlier disturbances. Now, at intervals, the hiss gathered itself into a tone and then into a stack of tones that climbed and fell like steps on an ancient stairway. Some tones occluded others, and in the interference patterns there were gaps. Clean silences of exact duration that repeated with relentless patience. If a person spoke near the radio then, their voice seemed to thread through those gaps and return altered, syllables stretched into unfamiliar vowels, consonants softened into breath. It was not imitation. It was translation of possibility into form, as if the act of saying anything at all had to pass through the local grammar and return stamped with its seal. They tested magnetism with a child's simplicity, holding a bar magnet near the rim and dusting the air with iron filings from a paper envelope. Patterns assembled in the space between hand and hole, not the ordinary arcs that school books teach, but nested spirals that seem to seek a limit and never arrive. When they shifted the magnet a few inches, the spirals reoriented with a fluidity that implied a partner field moving to meet them. For a moment, everyone in the clearing held their breath at the idea that their intention, where to put a hand, where to shake a wrist, carried weight here. That their choices drew answers from beneath the ground. If you liked this video, please give it a like and subscribe to our channel. Also, leave your comments below and tell us, what are your thoughts on scientists sending a drone into Mel's hole? We want to hear from you. Thank you for watching and see you next time.